My brother found out I had a high-paying job and a girlfriend, so he tried to secretly sell her into slavery and kill me, but I knew what to do and took revenge immediately. Hi, Reddit. My name is Daniel, and if you told me a year ago that my entire life would unravel like a thriller novel, I would have laughed in your face. I had it all. A promising career, a loving fiancé, and a future so perfectly mapped out that nothing could shake it. Or so I thought. Then, my parents decided that my happiness wasn't as important as their reputation. That my fiancée, Claire, wasn't good enough. And in their twisted logic, they made a decision that changed everything. They sold me out. Literally. Let me take you back to where it all started. Claire and I met in the most ordinary way, at a coffee shop in Silverpine, a city that thrived on ambition and money. She was new in town, and I was just another guy in line waiting for my caffeine fix. She realized she'd forgotten her wallet and was about to step out of line when I offered to cover her order. She hesitated, but her deep hazel eyes met mine, and I knew I wanted to keep talking to her. That one small act turned into a conversation, which turned into hours of effortless laughter. Before I knew it, she had become my world. A year later, I proposed. She said yes. Life felt perfect. But my parents, Elaine and Victor Monroe, disagreed. They had spent years cultivating their pristine image in Silverpine's elite circles. My father, a high-powered real estate mogul, and my mother, a former socialite turned philanthropist, had envisioned a different life for me. One that didn't include a woman they deemed ordinary. They made it clear from the beginning. Subtle at first, pointed questions, tight-lipped smiles. Then, as the wedding date approached, the gloves came off. "This isn't the kind of marriage we can support," my mother said one evening, her tone eerily calm. My father, always the businessman, was more blunt. "If you go through with this, Daniel, don't expect our help. Or our name." I told them I didn't need their name, their money, or their approval. I was marrying Claire with or without them. But I underestimated just how far they were willing to go to stop me. A week before the wedding, I was taken, kidnapped, dragged from the streets of Silverpine into the back of an unmarked SUV. I fought, I screamed, but they were stronger. And as the car sped away, a voice muttered from the front seat. "You shouldn't have asked so many questions." That's when I knew this wasn't random. This wasn't a mugging gone wrong. Someone had set me up. And when I found out who, it shattered everything I had ever believed about family. I woke up to the suffocating heat pressing against my skin. My head throbbed, my body ached, and my wrists burned from where they had been tied too tightly. Blinking through the blinding sunlight, I tried to make sense of where I was. Gone were the towering glass buildings of Silverpine, the familiar hum of the city. Instead, I was surrounded by endless fields, stretching far beyond the horizon. Rows of crops, thick and wild, swayed in the dry wind, and scattered among them people. They moved slowly, hunched over, working under the brutal sun. Their clothes hung loose on their bodies, stained with dirt and sweat. Some of them looked up briefly, their gazes empty, before returning to their work. I pushed myself up, my limbs screaming in protest. I wasn't bound anymore, but the raw red marks on my wrists told me how long I had been restrained. My mouth was dry, my throat raw. Then, a shadow loomed over me. "Get up." The voice was sharp, commanding. I turned to see a man standing above me, gripping a wooden cane in one hand. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with sun-darkened skin and cold, assessing eyes. Two more men stood behind him, their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. "Where the hell am I?" I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The man didn't answer. He just pointed toward the nearest row of crops. "You work," he said. "No questions." I stared at him, my mind racing. This had to be a mistake. A sick joke. "Listen, I don't belong here," I said, forcing my voice to steady. "I was taken, kidnapped. My family." The cane slammed against the dirt inches from my feet, sending dust flying. "No questions," the man repeated. His tone didn't change, but there was an unmistakable warning behind it. I glanced at the other workers, at the way they kept their heads down, at the faint bruises on some of their arms. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a farm. This was forced labor. I had been sold. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stand, my muscles protesting every movement. For now, I needed to play along to figure out where I was, who these people were, and how the hell I was going to get out. As I stumbled toward the crops, the truth settled over me like a suffocating weight. My parents hadn't just disowned me. They had erased me. And I was going to make them pay. The first few days blurred into one long nightmare. The sun was relentless, beating down on my back as I worked, my fingers numb from pulling weeds and digging through dry, cracked soil. My body ached in places I never knew could hurt, and my stomach was constantly empty. They fed us just enough to keep us standing stale bread, watery soup. At night, we were locked inside a wooden shelter, crammed together on the dirt floor. Nobody spoke much. The others, men and women of all ages, kept their heads down, their eyes hollow. They had been here too long. But I wasn't like them. I refused to be. I spent every second studying my surroundings, watching the guards, noting the shifts, the way they moved when they got lazy. There had to be a way out. And then there was Adam. He was one of us, but different. A lean man in his early 40s, sharp-eyed and quiet, but not broken like the others. The first time I saw him, he was working a few feet away, his hands moving methodically through the soil. Unlike the others, he didn't avoid looking at me. He studied me. "You're new," he muttered under his breath, barely moving his lips. I hesitated, my pulse spiking. Talking was risky. "Yeah," I whispered. He didn't say anything else, just nodded slightly before turning back to his work. But later that night, as I lay on the dirt floor of the shelter, exhausted and aching, I felt someone nudge my foot. I turned to find Adam crouched next to me, his expression unreadable. "You don't belong here," he said quietly. "No kidding." His lips quirked, just a fraction. "Who are you?" I hesitated. I didn't know if I could trust him. But what did I have to lose? "Daniel Monroe," I whispered. "My parents." My throat tightened. I couldn't even say it out loud. Adam exhaled through his nose. "Figured you were someone important. You don't move like the others. You fight." I frowned. "How long have you been here?" "Too long." His gaze darkened. "But I'm getting out." I stared at him. "You have a plan?" A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "I don't say things I don't mean." Hope surged in my chest, but I tamped it down. If he had a plan, why was he still here? "Then why haven't you left?" I asked. Adam's jaw clenched. He looked away. "Because I have unfinished business." I didn't press. I knew that look, the kind that held ghosts too heavy to speak of. Before I could say anything else, the door creaked open and one of the guards stepped in, flashlight in hand. Adam was gone in an instant, melting back into the shadows of the shelter like he had never been there at all. But that night, for the first time since I was taken, I felt something other than exhaustion and rage. I had an ally. Now, I just had to survive long enough to use him. I don't know why this memory came back to me, but as I lay there in the dirt, staring at the ceiling, I could hear my father's voice as clearly as if he were standing over me. "Family is about legacy, Daniel." I had been sitting across from him in his office, the silver pine skyline glowing behind him. It was a week before I proposed to Claire, and I had come to tell him my decision. "Your mother and I built something that will last for generations. That means making choices that benefit the family, not just yourself." I remember gripping the armrests of my chair. "Loving Claire doesn't take anything away from our family." He sighed, shaking his head like I was a child who just didn't understand. "You're thinking with your heart, not your head." "She makes me happy," I said. "Isn't that enough?" "No." The finality in his voice made me stiffen. "You're not a child anymore," he continued, leaning forward. "Love fades. What matters is what you build, what you leave behind." I had wanted to argue, to scream at him that he was wrong. But I didn't. Because deep down I knew he wouldn't listen. But I never thought he would go this far. The next morning, the guards were harsher than usual, barking orders, shoving people into place. Something had them on edge. Then, out of nowhere, a man collapsed. 1 second he was pulling weeds. The next, he was on the ground, convulsing. His body jerked violently, his mouth foaming. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. One of the guards stepped forward, nudged him with his boot. When the man didn't respond, he swore under his breath. "Get rid of him." 2 workers, older men, hesitated before lifting the man's limp body and carrying him away toward the edge of the field. I turned to Adam. My heart was pounding. "Is he?" "He's dead," Adam said flatly. I felt sick. "What happened to him?" Adam glanced at the guards before lowering his voice. "They don't care if we live or die. They feed us just enough to keep us working. Some of us don't last. A chill ran through me. I clenched my fists. I wasn't going to die here. No matter what it took, I was getting out. And I was going to burn everything my parents built to the ground. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man collapsing in the field, his body convulsing, his lips foaming. His death was treated like nothing. Just another day. Just another worker lost. The worst part was that nobody reacted. Nobody cried out. Nobody looked shocked. This wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Adam sat across from me in the shelter, his back against the wooden wall, his arms crossed. He wasn't sleeping either. His gaze flicked toward the locked door, then back to me. "How long do you think you've got?" he asked, voice low. "What? How long until they break you?" I clenched my jaw. "That's not gonna happen." He let out a short, humorless chuckle. "That's what I said too." I studied him, trying to read between the lines. "But you're still here." He exhaled through his nose. "I told you. I have unfinished business." I hesitated before asking who. His fingers tightened against his arms. He didn't answer right away. But after a long pause, he muttered, "My wife." Something in his voice sent a chill through me. I had expected him to say something like revenge, a name, a person he wanted to kill. But the way he said it, soft and distant, wasn't anger. It was grief. "What happened to her?" I asked. Adam's jaw flexed, but he didn't snap at me, didn't tell me to shut up. Instead, his fingers traced something in the dirt floor. "We were taken together." His voice was even, too even, like he had told this story so many times that he no longer felt the words. "She lasted 6 months. A cold wave of understanding settled over me. I didn't ask how she died. I didn't need to. I looked around at the other workers. Some were already asleep, their bodies curled up, their breathing slow and steady. Others just stared into the dark, silent and unmoving. Adam shifted, finally looking me in the eye. "If you're serious about getting out of here, we need to move soon." I nodded. "I'm ready." The next morning, I worked harder than ever. Not because I was obedient, but because I needed to study the guards, their movements, their blind spots. I had always been observant, a skill drilled into me since childhood by my father. "Always watch the room before you speak." He used to say that before sending me into high-profile dinners with men twice my age. Now, I was using his lesson against him. There were 4 main guards during the day. The one they called Mac was the biggest, built like a bull, with a temper just as nasty. He was the one who shoved people when they worked too slow, who threw the food on the ground like we were animals. Then there was Kellen, a lanky, quiet man who smoked constantly and barely spoke. He seemed the least invested in this whole thing, only doing what was required. The third was Roman, short and stocky, always watching but never acting. And then there was the last one, the leader. They called him Crow. I had only seen him a few times. He rarely came out during the day. But when he did, everyone stiffened, worked faster. Even the guards. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. He carried a presence that demanded obedience. I knew I had to avoid him at all costs. Adam and I worked in silence, communicating with small gestures, brief glances. By midday, I had a rough understanding of their routine. The water barrels were refilled around noon. The food was brought out at sunset. The nighttime guards were different, less aggressive, less interested in what we did, assuming we were too tired to try anything. That was our window. That night, when the guards locked us inside the shelter, I felt the shift in the air. Adam sat down next to me and whispered, "Tonight." My pulse spiked. "You sure?" He gave a small nod. "There's a storm coming. If it's loud enough, it'll cover the noise." I looked up. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, I could see the clouds rolling in. The air was thick, heavy. The first drops of rain pattered against the roof. I took a slow, steady breath. This was it. Adam moved first. He crawled toward the back of the shelter, his fingers feeling along the ground. I followed. "Here," he whispered. I felt it, a loose board. He pried it up slowly, carefully. The nails barely held it in place. A small opening. Just enough to squeeze through. We waited. Listened. The rain picked up, thunder rolling in the distance. "Now," Adam whispered. I slid through first, landing in the mud outside. My heart pounded. I turned back, helping Adam through. We crouched low, barely breathing. We had seconds before someone noticed. We moved, staying low, using the crops for cover. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through my clothes. My muscles ached, but I ignored it. I could see the fence in the distance, stretching out into the darkness. Then I heard it. Shouts. They knew. "Run," Adam hissed. I bolted, my legs burning, my lungs screaming. Footsteps pounded behind us, voices shouting orders. The fence was close. Too close. Adam reached it first. He gripped the wooden post, climbing up. I followed, my hands slipping on the wetwood. A gunshot rang out. I flinched, my grip tightening. The bullet slammed into the fence post just inches from Adam's head. He didn't stop. He reached the top, swung his leg over. Another shot. I felt it before I heard it. A hot, sharp pain tore through my shoulder. I gasped, my grip faltering. Daniel. Adam grabbed me, pulling me up. I pushed through the pain, throwing myself over the fence. The second I hit the ground, I was running again. Adam pulled me to my feet, half dragging me forward. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. We ran until the field disappeared behind us, until the voices faded, until my body was so numb I didn't feel the wound anymore. And then, through the rain and mist, I saw it. A road. A gas station in the distance, lights glowing like a beacon. I staggered forward, pushing through the last of my strength. When I stepped inside, the cashier's eyes widened. Jesus, man? Are you okay? I gripped the counter, my vision swimming. Call the police. Then everything went black. When I woke up, the first thing I felt was pain. A deep, burning ache in my shoulder, pulsing with every beat of my heart. The second thing I felt was warmth, clean sheets, a firm mattress beneath me. For a moment, I panicked. My last memory was the gas station, Adam pulling me through the rain, the desperate sprint for freedom. Had they found me? Had they dragged me back? I forced my eyes open, heart hammering, and was met with the sterile white walls of a hospital room. I wasn't back at the farm. I was safe. A slow exhale left my lips. The pain in my shoulder was sharp but manageable. I turned my head and saw Adam sitting in a chair by the window, arms crossed, staring outside. His shirt was clean, but his face was still lined with exhaustion. He must have felt my eyes on him because he turned, his expression unreadable. You're awake, he said. Looks like it, I croaked. My throat was dry raw. Adam stood, grabbed a cup of water from the table, and handed it to me. I drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing the fire in my throat. How long? I asked. 2 days. I blinked. 2. You passed out before you even hit the floor at the gas station, he said, sitting back down. They called an ambulance. You were running on fumes. I let that sink in. 2 days gone. 2 days of the world moving while I lay unconscious. The cops? I asked. Adam's lips pressed into a thin line. They're outside. Been waiting for you to wake up. I pushed myself up, wincing as pain shot through my shoulder. Adam leaned forward, but I waved him off. What happened to the farm? Adam exhaled. They raided it. Took the bastards down. Your tip gave them exactly what they needed. He paused. The others, they're free now. A strange, overwhelming relief crashed over me. I had spent weeks watching those people suffer, feeling the weight of their silence. And now, they weren't trapped anymore. Adam shifted in his chair. They asked me to give a statement, but I told them I'd wait until you woke up. I met his gaze, understanding the unspoken words. He wasn't just waiting for me to wake up. He was waiting for me to decide what happened next. Before I could respond, the door opened. 2 police officers stepped in, one older, graying at the temples, the other younger, looking barely past his 20s. The older officer, Detective Reynolds, according to his badge, gave me a slow nod. Mr. Monroe, he said. I'm glad to see you awake. Thanks, I said hoarsely. The younger officer, Ramirez, pulled out a notepad. We have a lot of questions. But first, is there anyone you'd like us to call? Family, friends? I nearly laughed. Family? My family had done this to me. No, I said firmly. Detective Reynolds studied me for a long moment like he was trying to piece something together. Then he pulled out a small recorder and placed it on the bedside table. Can you tell us everything? He asked. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Then I told them. I told them about the farm, about the guards, about the people trapped there. I told them about Adam, about the escape, about the gunshots in the rain. And then I told them the part one had been holding on to, the part that had festered in my guts since the moment I woke up in that field. My parents were behind this, I said. The room went silent. Reynolds and Ramirez exchanged a glance. Adam, who had been sitting quietly, clenched his jaw. What do you mean? Ramirez asked carefully. I met Reynolds' gaze. I mean, this wasn't random. They knew exactly where to find me. They knew where I'd be when I'd be alone. My parents wanted me gone. Ramirez hesitated, pen hovering over his notepad. That's a serious accusation. I let out a humorless laugh. I'm aware. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. Do you have proof? I swallowed hard. I didn't. Not yet. But I knew. No, I admitted. But if you dig into their finances, their business dealings, you'll find it. Reynolds studied me for a long moment, then nodded. We'll look into it. I didn't know if they actually would. People like my parents were powerful. They had friends in high places, money to make problems disappear. But I wasn't going to let this go. As the officers wrapped up their questions, Adam remained quiet, watching, listening. When they finally left, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I exhaled slowly. "I'm thinking this isn't over." Adam nodded. "No, it's not." I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. My parents had sent me away to be erased, to be forgotten. But I had survived. And now I was going to make them pay. The day I was discharged from the hospital, I felt like a ghost walking through a world that had kept spinning without me. The air outside smelled fresher, crisper, like freedom itself. But inside I was anything but free. Every step I took was weighed down by the truth I now carried: my own parents had done this to me. Adam walked beside me as I stepped out of the hospital doors, his hands shoved in his pockets. He didn't say much, but then again he never did unless it mattered. "They think you're dead," he finally muttered. I glanced at him, my chest tightening. "What?" "Your parents," he said, watching my reaction. "You vanished for weeks. No ransom, no public outcry. That tells me one thing: they weren't expecting you to come back." A cold, ugly realization settled over me. He was right. My parents never reported me missing. Never called the police. They had wiped their hands of me the second I was thrown into that field. I clenched my fists. "Then let's make sure they know I'm alive." Adam smirked. "That's the spirit." But before I could even think about confronting my parents, I needed proof. A feeling wasn't enough. Detective Reynolds had said he'd look into it, but I knew how these things worked. People like my father had shields, lawyers, connections, money that could bury the truth before it ever saw daylight. Which meant I needed to get to it first. Adam and I checked into a small motel just outside Silver Pine. It was the kind of place where the receptionist didn't ask questions and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's TV. I didn't care. I wasn't planning on staying long. As I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at my phone, my pulse quickened. I had turned it on an hour ago, half expecting my mother or father to have left messages, to have called in some weak attempt to cover their tracks. But there was nothing. No missed calls. No worried texts. No signs that they had even noticed I was gone. Adam leaned against the wall, watching me. "Still think you can go back to your old life?" I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "That life is gone." He nodded, like he had known the answer before I had. "Then let's burn theirs down instead." The first crack in my parents' armor came from an unexpected place. I had spent my whole life in their world, surrounded by powerful people who spoke in whispers and made deals over expensive wine. But I had also learned something else: no matter how careful someone is, there's always someone watching from the edges. That someone was Greg Harmon, my father's former accountant. I remembered him from childhood, a nervous man with thin glasses who never quite fit in with my father's polished associates. He had been on payroll for years until one day, quietly, he wasn't. I never thought much of it at the time. But now, sitting in the motel room, I realized he might be exactly what I needed. I found him in a rundown office building on the outskirts of the city. The plaque on his door read Harmon and Associates, but the receptionist's desk was empty and the waiting room smelled like stale coffee and regret. When I knocked on his office door, he barely glanced up from his stack of paperwork. "If you're looking for tax help, I'm a..." Then he saw my face. He paled. "Daniel?" I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "Long time, Greg?" He stared at me like I was a ghost. "Jesus Christ. I thought you..." "Yeah, I cut in. A lot of people did." He swallowed hard, fidgeting with his pen. "What do you want?" I sat down across from him, leaning forward. "The truth." He tensed. "I don't..." I held up a hand. "Save it. I know my parents were involved in what happened to me. I just need proof." Greg's hands trembled slightly as he rubbed his forehead. "Daniel, you don't know what you're asking." I met his gaze. "Actually, I do. I need bank records, payments, anything that ties them to the people who took me." He shook his head. "You think I kept those?" "I got out for a reason." I studied him, watching the way his fingers tapped anxiously against the desk. Greg had been a numbers guy his whole life, a man who knew where every dollar went. He wasn't the type to walk away from a job without keeping an insurance policy. "You have something," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "Even if I did. If I help you, they'll come after me." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Greg, if you don't help me, they'll keep doing this. To other people. Maybe even to you one day. You know what my father's capable of." His eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe. But then he let out a long, shaky breath. "Damn it." He reached for a locked drawer in his desk, pulled out a thick folder. and slid it across the desk. If you're gonna do this, you better do it right. I opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a transaction, a large sum wired to a company I didn't recognize. But as I flipped through the pages, my stomach twisted. The payments weren't just for me. There were others. Names, dates, amounts. My parents hadn't just sold me out. They had been doing this for years. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the pages. Each line, each name was another punch to the gut. Payments stretching back nearly a decade. I wasn't special. I wasn't the first. My parents had been funding this operation for years. The numbers painted a sickening story. Every few months, large sums of money were funneled into shell companies, accounts that didn't lead anywhere real, but were tied to businesses overseas, fake charity funds, and construction projects that never broke ground. Some of the payments were marked under vague descriptions: logistics, consulting fees, property acquisitions. But I knew better. These were the prices of human lives. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. These names? I whispered, tracing my finger over the list. These are... Greg cut in, his voice low. People like you. People your father wanted gone. I looked up at him, the weight of his words crushing me. How many? He hesitated, then shook his head. Too many. A bitter taste filled my mouth. I had spent years believing my father was just another ruthless businessman. Someone who valued power over emotions, deals over family. But this wasn't just greed. This wasn't just control. This was something far worse. I closed the folder, forcing my hands to steady. Greg, why did you keep this? His lips pressed into a thin line. Because I knew one day he'd turn on me too. That made sense. My father never let loose ends dangle. Greg had been smart enough to see the writing on the wall. Why now? I asked. Greg let out a humorless chuckle. Because I never thought you'd actually make it out. I exhaled slowly, gripping the folder tighter. The truth was right here. The evidence I needed. Now I had to decide what to do with it. I didn't go back to the motel. I needed somewhere safe, somewhere they wouldn't expect me to be. Adam had a contact, a former journalist named Claire Lawson. She had built her career exposing corruption in Silverpine before suddenly going off the grid. The official story was that she had retired, but I wasn't buying it. When Adam and I showed up at her door, she didn't look surprised to see us. Well, she said, leaning against the frame. Didn't expect to see your face again, Monroe. I frowned. You know me? Claire smirked. I know everyone who matters in this city. She stepped aside, letting us in. The place was small, cluttered with old newspapers, stacks of files, and coffee cups that hadn't been cleaned in days. The walls were covered in photos, articles, and scribbled notes. Trails of corruption leading to places people didn't want her looking. I handed her the folder. I need this to go public. She whistled as she flipped through it. Damn. And here I thought I'd seen the worst of Silverpine. Her gaze flickered up to me. You realize what happens if I publish this, right? I nodded. Yeah, they'll come after me. She shook her head. Not just you. Everyone attached to this. Your parents are powerful. They have friends in places you don't even know exist. This isn't just some corporate scandal, this is organized trafficking. The kind of thing people get killed over. Adam crossed his arms. We're not asking you to protect us. Claire studied him, then turned her attention back to me. And what about you, Monroe? What's your endgame? I hadn't thought about that. Not really. Revenge had been fueling me ever since I crawled out of that hellhole. But what did I actually want? To see my parents in prison? To watch everything they built crumble? I thought of all the names in that folder. All the people who hadn't made it out. People like Adam's wife. People like the man who collapsed in the field. His body left in the dirt like he was nothing. This has to stop, I said finally. I don't care what happens to me. I just want them to pay. Claire watched me for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right, she said. Let's blow this up. Claire moved fast. Within hours, she had scanned and encrypted the documents, sending them to trusted sources, journalists she had worked with in the past, people too stubborn or too reckless to be bought off. I sat in the corner of her apartment watching as she pieced everything together, cross-referencing names and accounts with past scandals, connecting dots I hadn't even considered. These companies, she muttered, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Your father's not just paying for people to disappear. He's laundering the money through real estate, offshore accounts, and fake development projects. It's textbook. I leaned forward. How long until we go public? She kept typing, her fingers flying over the keyboard. I can have the first article out in a few hours, but once it's live, there's no going back. Your parents will know exactly who leaked it. I clenched my fists. Let them. Adam, who had been leaning against the wall, finally spoke. We need a backup plan. Claire smirked. Oh, I have one. She turned her laptop around, showing us the screen. I'm sending the files to every major news outlet, federal agency, and watchdog group I can find. If anything happens to me, you, or Daniel, this thing doesn't just leak, it floods. I exhaled slowly. This was it. Claire cracked her knuckles. All right, Monroe. Time to set fire to your father's empire. She hit send. The fallout was immediate. The article dropped at midnight. By morning, every major news station was running the story, billionaire Victor Monroe tied to human trafficking and corruption scandal. Social media exploded with outrage. Protesters gathered outside Monroe Global's headquarters. The FBI launched an official investigation. And then my phone rang. I stared at the caller ID, my stomach twisting. My mother. Adam and Claire watched me as I debated answering. I pressed accept, bringing the phone to my ear. You ungrateful little bastard, Elaine Monroe hissed before I could say a word. I laughed, bitter and cold. Nice to hear from you too, Mom. What have you done? She snapped. What you made me do, I shot back. I gave you a chance. I gave you years to prove you cared about me. Instead, you sold me like a bad investment. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, she warned. This is bigger than you. Bigger than us. I leaned back in my chair. Then I guess we'll all burn together. Silence. Then, softer, almost pleading. Daniel, come home. We can fix this. I clenched my jaw. There's no we anymore. I hung up. Adam nodded in approval. Good call. But Claire frowned. You realize they won't just sit back and take this, right? Your father isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat. She was right. That night, we relocated to a different safe house, a small apartment under Claire's friend's name. Every news channel we turned on had my father's face plastered across the screen, followed by grim-faced reporters discussing possible charges, corporate fallout, and FBI raids. Then something unexpected happened. Victor Monroe vanished. One moment, he was under legal review. The next, he was nowhere to be found. Claire swore under her breath. He's running. Adam tightened his grip on his gun. Or regrouping. I felt it in my gut. This wasn't over. My father wasn't the type to run. He was the type to retaliate. And I had just made myself his #1 target. The moment my father disappeared, everything changed. The scandal wasn't just about headlines anymore, it became a hunt. The FBI froze Monroe Global's accounts, seized assets, and issued warrants, but Victor Monroe had spent decades making sure he could slip through cracks no one else even knew existed. Claire sat at her desk, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand tapping anxiously against the wood. No sightings, no movement on any of his known accounts, she muttered. It's like he vanished off the face of the earth. Adam paced near the window, glancing outside every few seconds. He had barely spoken in the last hour, but I could tell he was on edge. His instincts, honed by years of survival, told him what I already suspected. My father wasn't hiding. He was planning. The call came at 3 a.m. My phone vibrated, the number unknown. Adam tensed as I answered. Hello? A deep voice I hadn't heard in weeks rumbled through the speaker. You've made a mistake, Daniel. I went still. Where are you? Victor Monroe exhaled, almost amused. That's not the question you should be asking. I gripped the phone tighter. Then what should I be asking, Dad? A pause. Then his voice dropped into something colder. How far are you willing to go? The call ended. Claire and Adam were already moving. Claire traced the number, typing rapidly while Adam grabbed his gun, checking the clip. He's not done, Adam muttered. That was a warning. I clenched my jaw. No. That was an invitation. A few hours later, Claire found the first clue. A plane, privately chartered, had left the city the night before, heading toward a remote estate just outside Crestford, an old-money enclave known for keeping secrets. The kind of place where people like my father disappeared until the dust settled. We have to move now, I said, already grabbing my jacket. Adam didn't argue. Claire hesitated. You're walking straight into his world, she warned. This isn't like before. There's no escaping twice. I met her gaze. I'm not planning to escape this time. Adam and I left before sunrise. The estate sat at the end of a winding road hidden behind tall iron gates and acres of forest. The kind of place built for privacy, for deals made in whispers and handshakes. The car barely rolled to a stop before Adam turned to me. If we go in, we finish it, he said. I nodded. We finish it. We stepped out of the car. The gates were already open. He was expecting me. Inside, the estate was eerily quiet. No guards. No security swarming the place. Just my father, standing in the center of the grand foyer, dressed in a dark suit like he was heading to a board meeting. My mother stood beside him, hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. Daniel, my father said smoothly. You made good time. I forced myself to stay calm. You ran. His lips curled into a smirk. I adjusted. I took a step forward. This is over. His expression didn't waver. Is it? I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folder Greg had given me. The evidence. The names. The proof of every life they had destroyed. I threw it onto the table between us. It's done, I said. The world knows. The FBI knows. You're not coming back from this. My father glanced at the papers, then back at me, completely unfazed. You think this ends with an article and a few government raids? He stepped closer. I built an empire that doesn't crumble just because someone like you feels betrayed. I clenched my fists. You sold me. My mother finally spoke. We protected you. I turned to her, stunned by the sheer audacity of the lie. Protected me? I took a step closer, my voice shaking. You threw me away like I was a liability. You had me kidnapped, sent to, my breath hitched. To die. She swallowed, but her face remained composed. You were making a mistake, Daniel. We did what we had to do. Adam scoffed beside me. I've seen a lot of things, lady. But selling your own kid like a bad stock trade? That's new. My father exhaled, shaking his head. You still don't understand, do you? He looked at me like I was some foolish child. This was never about you, Daniel. It was about control. About making sure everything stayed exactly the way it was supposed to be. I stared at him, my stomach twisting with rage. Well, you failed. For the first time, something flickered across his face, something close to frustration. You had a place, Daniel. A legacy. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. And you threw it away. I met his gaze, steel in my spine. No. You did. For a moment, we just stood there. The air thick with everything unspoken. Then I heard it. Sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, cutting across the dark. My father turned his head slightly, and for the first time, I saw it. A crack in his armor. Adam smirked. Looks like your empire's crumbling after all. My father straightened his tie, his expression hardening. My mother didn't move, didn't speak. I took one last look at them, the people who had raised me, who had shaped me. And I realized something. I felt nothing for them anymore. When the front doors burst open and the FBI swarmed the room, I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just watched as my father was led away in handcuffs. And for the first time in my life, I was free. The trial was fast, brutal, and merciless. My father's empire collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. With Claire's reporting, Greg's documents, and my testimony, the case against Victor and Elaine Monroe was airtight. There was no room for negotiation, no chance for a last-minute deal. I sat in the courtroom watching as the prosecution laid out every crime, every transaction, every life my parents had destroyed for their own gain. The victims' names were read aloud, their stories echoed through the chamber. Some were still missing. Some would never be found. My father barely reacted. He sat stiffly in his chair, his expression unreadable. He wasn't a man used to losing. My mother, on the other hand, looked paler with every passing minute, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She still believed there was a way out of this. But there wasn't. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty. On all counts. I watched as the judge sentenced Victor Monroe to life in prison. My mother received 25 years. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read, but I could feel the tension, the finality in the air. When the officers moved to take my parents away, my mother turned to me, her lips parting as if to say something. I didn't wait to hear it. I stood up and walked out. Outside, Claire and Adam were waiting. Claire was on the phone, probably setting up another interview or chasing the next lead. Adam was leaning against the courthouse steps, arms crossed, watching me carefully. It's done, I said. Adam studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good. Claire hung up and grinned. You just took down one of the most powerful families in the country. How does it feel? I thought about it. The weight of it all. The years spent chasing their approval, the betrayal, the scars, both seen and unseen. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. Feels like I can finally breathe. Claire smirked. So what now? That was the question, wasn't it? I had spent so long fighting, surviving, that I hadn't thought about what came next. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I turned to Adam. You still got that unfinished business? He nodded slowly. Yeah. I looked at Claire. Think you've got room for another story? Her grin widened. Always. I exhaled and glanced at the sky. The sun was shining. The air crisp. A new beginning. I didn't know where I was going next. But I knew one thing. I was finally free. And that was enough.